Good afternoon. It is Friday afternoon. Kind of bleak we're looking. As the days come closer to, I think, our version of the terrible hurricane in Florida. Uh, can't even imagine. I just can't even imagine what those folks are going through and the devastation that I'm going to be. It's going to sound like I'm being a wise guy, and I am not. That perhaps we might have futured for more carefully as far as those kinds of things. And then the other way to answer it is that when those kind of catastrophes come, it's pretty hard to prepare for those altogether. So at any rate, we move on from that, and our prayers and my prayers, and I'm sure your prayers and best wishes and support will go to everyone who needs that sort of support, whether it be responders or the victims of this terrible thing. And when you can only hope that we build back better and leave it at that for the moment. Um, all right, so a few things to speak to, and some of them I know are repetitive and not necessarily in any kind of priority order. One would be that, as I always say over the weekend, is I am available on Mondays from 6 to 7 in an optional frame uh, to hopefully meet you. I only met, I think, 3 of you along the way. And in fact, I was about to sign off the other night when one of the students signed on, and you know who you are, and I appreciate that you got on. We had a very nice conversation, and we helped each other learn a few things about the things we need to learn some things about insofar as this class. I learned from you, and you learned from me, and hope it was as productive for you as it was for me. And those meetings will continue. They are optional. If I think they have value, for the whole with a W, I will record it and send it out, and I will expect all of you to watch it on your clock, on your watch, as when you can squeeze it in. And that's up to you. So that's the first piece. The other piece is that the date for the due date for midterm rapidly approaches. I just checked today to see whether anyone has posted up, and as of this moment, no one has, and that's okay because it's not due yet. I spent considerable time working people through it and helping you consider what you want to say about that. And for at least the fifth time I can remember, I go back to the point that I'm not trying to figure out what you don't know so I can give you bad grades. I'm trying to figure out what you do know so that I can adjust formatively. And I deliberately use that word today. So I can formatively adjust for compensating holes that I think I see in what everyone has written altogether, insofar as what I may have missed in my own instruction to you. That's part of what I think a midterm should be about, because it's a formative assessment. Remember that, and realize I've said that phrase more than once already. So that's due soon. If anyone has any kind of questions, you can email me. Those of you who email me with any kind of regularity, not too many of you but there are a couple, and I actually look forward to those emails for a chance to interact with you individually. So if you have any questions, if you want me to give a quick scan of what you've put together in a draft, I'll give you that feedback. I have the time. I'm very, very busy. He smiled, but certainly I'll figure out a way to give you some feedback if that's something that you think to do the best job that you can. So that's due pretty soon, and we'll take that from there. So again, the syllabus dictates what we're going to do next, and we're pretty much on target. On the other hand, I'm kind of frowning as I look at you, figuratively speaking. On the other hand, the course is moving too rapidly for me. I would probably spend a whole heck of a lot more time in the program design piece than I have. And if I find a way to come back to that, I will. I also just remember that I found a great article about gamification and training. And I just actually telling myself to remember to put that up. So somebody be my conscience. And if you don't see it in a day or two, because I have to figure out how to be able to post this on Blackboard. That's really where we're heading in a not too distant future. When we talk about simulation design, gamification, which sometimes I think is just a cutesy word for lots of things, but certainly is a buzzword. And again, I'm demeaning it by using that term, is a popular premise people are exploring in all kinds of ways not just in video games as such. So we'll get to that, but I thought this one particular article was interesting, and I will make sure that you see it and hope that you have some opinions about it as well. Uh, Enough said. You have a discussion question up that's along the same lines of where we're going. We've been doing what's your strengths, what's your weaknesses, tell me how they work. In this case, I'm just interested to see how you might prioritize some of these things in terms of designing not only the needs assessment, but the needs assessment program. Two different things. A program, and watch my fingers go, a program is a spiral. A spiral means things add to add to add to. Now, if you think about the days when you were in school, there are certain courses that you took. They didn't have to spiral so much. I might get in trouble for saying this. Sometimes I think if you're learning English, it's not like you have to, learn all the verbs first and then learn the nouns. That's kind of silly. You can't learn it that way. You have to learn it as a whole. And then even when you read novels or short stories or wrote novels and short stories or poetry, it wasn't like as though things had to be linked to each other. But there are other courses that you took, whether you were in elementary or college or in high schools, that were dependent on each other, that spiraled together. A not great example is history. History builds on itself. You really can't study the post, I'm being a wise guy, you really can't study the post-Civil War Reconstruction effects if you don't know what the Civil War was about before that. One thing had to go before the other. And it's kind of hard, and that's when sometimes people get in trouble nowadays when they argue politics when they don't know what they're talking about because they really don't have the ability to get their arms around the whole with a W of what it was that they learned when they talk about civics and history and social studies and economics and that whole genre of learning, which I'm particularly very interested in as such. Now, but a better example is math. Well, if you don't know the 7 comes after 6, it's pretty hard to count up to 7. And things spiral together. You don't know how to multiply. You really can't divide very well. I mean, I guess there are ways students can learn, not being a person all that skilled in math himself. I can't say that for a fact, but it spiraled together. It built on itself. And so when we talk about program design, we're talking about spiraling. Right? In certain senses, you recognize what you need to be able to do a needs assessment. We've begun to deal with program design. And again, I'm going to come back to that if I'm not satisfied with some of the things we probably could have explored more carefully, but I'll figure out a way to squeeze that in a little later in the course. This course kind of spirals together, by the way, I think, very nicely. I don't take any credit for that, but I think it does. It is designed well insofar as the goals are concerned. And the same would hold true for if you have a muscle now. Some of you mentioned this actually in your discussion questions from last week. If you have a muscle in program design, but you don't know how to evaluate, then the program design there's something wrong with the program design, and vice versa. If the program design looks really strong, but you haven't built in the program to build to the evaluation, it falls down. The pillars have to need each other to keep the roof up. Does that make sense? And so I talked about backward design a couple of times. I mentioned Grant Wiggins. If you really hung up, and this may not work for all of you, when you sit down and really try to create one of a true front to back spiral needs assessment program, sometimes you want to work backwards. Now, how will you evaluate the goals that you have? Are the evaluations key to the goals? Let me give you an example. Let me think out loud. If an evaluation question was, what color are elephants? Terrible example. And the answer, I guess, is mostly gray. Maybe that's not always true, but it seems to me gray is the elephant's typical color is. And you haven't built in a strategy where the students, the learners, can master that point, that most elephants are gray, then the evaluation isn't worth anything at all. If an objective you have is that students will, I keep saying students, that your participants will be able to identify three, this is an objective now because I'm putting a number on it, three ways to greet an unhappy client. And the trainees can only tell you two. They haven't met the objective. Now, it could be that there was an issue with them learning that premise, or it could be that you didn't teach the third way. You didn't have to expose them to a strategy where they learn three ways as such. I'm being simplistic on purpose, but simple is sometimes good. In this case, I think simple is good because simple in this case reflects the power of a good evaluation. Or a couple of ways to look at it. To first of all, identify whether the goals that you set for the needs assessment have been met. And secondly, to be able to present and justify what you did for the value of and the worth of the company, of the organization. I mean, certain organizations, I think many of you are in, it sounds like you're in those kinds of organizations, really have to keep clients satisfied. I guess everyone has to keep a client satisfied, otherwise you wouldn't have any customers to pay your bills. So I guess that's one way to look at it. But anyway, you look at it, if you don't have a way to demonstrate to the boss or to each other, yeah, it's working. I can see the people are using these three processes. Well, that's good. And if that's the case, then we know it's been applied. And that goes back to those Bloom words. So without talking any too much more, let's let me put this PowerPoint in front of you, and we can use that as a baseline for conversations that you may want to have with each other or with yourself, which is actually a pretty good way to learn something by reflecting on it, as you seem to be doing in the discussions. So Dr. B is going to share it, share a PowerPoint, and here we go. Clear enough? How do you know? And I'm not sure if everybody believes this, and I'm not sure. I always believe it, but I don't remember who made the quote up. I'm embarrassed to tell you. Basically, we're working from the premise that what gets measured gets done. I'm not sure that's altogether true, but I think it's very likely true in most of the concrete things that we expect our workers and our stakeholders and our colleagues to be able to do. And that's why objectives have so much credence with the people with the pencils who add things up, or the people who work with spreadsheets. If I said my goal is to, again, find three ways to satisfy unhappy customers, and you're only getting one or two done, then the objective is not met, and we have to figure out why the objective is not met. Another way to look at it is say, well, three was probably asking too much, and the two is probably more than satisfactory. So the question is, how do you know? And you should be prepared for that question. You shape this program, and if anyone has any kind of value in terms of hearing and getting immersed in what you're offering to your bosses by way of a program, they should say in one form or another, how will we know whether the program worked or not? Well, the profits will go up. Well, maybe, I suppose. But if you can show, for example, that you're being more effective in wrapping the candy around the wrapper, per the I Love Lucy story I mentioned a few weeks ago, how will you know? Because the other part of that is how do you know, and how will you not know that what you didn't know to begin with? Put that under your pillow tonight. Let me say that again. I like the way it sounded. How will you not know what you didn't know in the first place? Was there something else you should have measured? And again, as I said before, where the learning processes you put in place, aligned to the evaluations, which again begs the issue of that you might want to work backwards. You may want to have your objectives, and then you may want to have an evaluation based on the objective and then plan backwards. It's hard to think that way. Our brains are not wired for that. There's something called backwards futuring. It's a strategy that futurists use to create a story about or a scenario which they decide to move away from or move towards. This is a terrible example. I hope that I'm wrong. Okay, I don't want this to happen. But let's say 10 years from now, futurists say we're going to war with China. So this is 2022. So 2032, we're going to be in a war with China. Then you say, well, what happened in 2009 that led to the war with China? Well, we continued to back Taiwan at the expense of our relationship with People's Republic of China, and that made them distrust us that much more. So they decided to take it into their own hands. I'm not advocating this. I'm just saying, giving you how a backward scenario looks. Well, then what happened in 2008 for you to take an action that made the Chinese not trust you in 2009? Work backwards. Well, what happened in 2000? I already got my numbers wrong. I said 2032. So it was 2031, 2030, and you work backwards. And that backward design brings you to 2022, where you say, where do I start? The goal we have out 10 years from now is to not have a war with China. What do we do in 2022 to do that? What do we do in 23 and 24? It's working back frontwards now to how we understand time, or think that we understand time to be. And there's a whole conversation I could bore you about. So the question always becomes, how will you know? Be clean and clear about what that's about. And I would suggest that you work backwards, at least at this piece, to think these things through. By the way, I wanted to mention, let me go back, Peter Drucker was the person who said that. Peter Drucker is an amazing person to read, a business organizational theorist. Some of his books are a little, probably a little older than I would want them to be in terms of research nowadays. But the man gets leadership. He gets it. And he also writes it in a way that doesn't put you to sleep. So I recommend trying to get some of his books for your own professional library. Now, we go along, and how do I know you know how to make something? Let's take a look at this. Did you ever try to teach somebody how to teach a child how to tie their shoes, or as my father struggled to do, to teach me how to tie a tie knot? Because this was a man who never wore a tie in his life, and I had to wear a tie to go to school, and I asked him to teach me how to do it, and he didn't have a clue. So we figured it out together. It was a bonding moment, I guess, but we did struggle with that. But the classic premise is, how do I do this? Well, this YouTube, I may not play it all, but this YouTube talks about how do I know how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and that is the outcome, isn't it? A successfully consumed peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But can you describe how to do that?
The thing that's different about a Vrbo vacation home, you always have the whole place to yourself. Just
Okay, that's enough of that.
Hi, my name is Jaden, and we're here to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. First, you need peanut butter, jelly, and bread to make your peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Don't forget your knife. Before using the knife, ask an adult for permission. So the first step is you need 2 pieces of bread. Your second step is to put your jelly and spread it on.
I think you know what a successful peanut butter and jelly sandwich outcome is. Enough said. So, but think about the steps this little girl, Jaden, I guess, put in place in order to see the linear spiral. That's the better way to put the spiral of things you needed to have and the processes you needed to do to make that peanut butter sandwich, a peanut butter sandwich. It begins with goals, okay? And so in terms of housekeeping and moving some things through, a good way to approach this is think about, again, what you think you need in terms of the materials and ideas that need to go with it. Always a rationale. Why do you need to evaluate the strategy that you have? Are those strategies, or rather those goals, worthy? I know I have make the same mistake once in a while. I'll make a goal for a goal for a goal and get bogged down in the trees instead of the forest, and it can become problematic. On the other hand, you have to have the right number of goals, so the appropriate number of goals to get your job done. But you should always review your goals more than once, bounce them off other people, see whether they agree with them, see if you can collapse them so that you don't have 1,000 goals in front of people, and then to choose the outcomes by way of criteria. Here's an interesting piece. I'm not sure if everyone's interested in what I'm going to share, but you see that Aaron Judge hit 61 home runs a day or two ago. A few people were as happy as I was about that. And then the other people jumped out of the woodwork and said, well, and even Aaron Judge has said, well, I didn't hit, the record is 73. The record is Barry Bonds is 70. It was a Bobby Bonds. They get mixed up between his father and him. His Bonds hit 73. And he's not going to get 73 home runs in the next 6 or 7 games. That's for sure. That's the record. Other people say, well, the reason why Bonds hit 73 home runs was because he was on steroids. And so we shouldn't count we shouldn't count that. It's not valid. Now, I'm not going to argue that point one way or another. I have an opinion about it, but that's not neither here nor there. But really what you're looking at is valid criteria for deciding. When a judge and a jury come together to try to make decisions about innocence or guilt, or assigning what needs to be done, the same issues prevail. What kind of legal criteria they use to use as their guidelines, as their guideposts, clean, strict criteria to analyze what data, what evidence they have in front of them to decide whether that criteria is valid. Always remember that word valid. That's biggie, right, as we talk about this. And then you choose the strategies. Now, that word alone, choosing evaluative strategies, is a course all by itself. Were we meeting in face-to-face, and if we were meeting synchronously online, I would probably have you immersed in a lot of evaluative strategies where you bounce off each other, not just in the discussion questions, which you're doing a great job with, and I applaud you for that. But I would come up with a lot of immersive simulation type strategies, where one group would be playing consumers and another group might be playing the bosses and so forth. And we'd have some real things going on where the outcome of the sum, the SUM of or those processes coming together would truly enable us to see what goals we have in terms of how we might set up a needs assessment process. So, but one way to do it on your own or with a small group of people, I call them your think tank buddies. What are the pluses and what are the minuses? What's the plus of this strategy? What's the minuses? And we've already talked about PMI in other ways as well. The same premise applies. What's the plus? What do you like about this? And what makes you think twice about it? If you said, well, I want someone to recite the entire manual about how to remove an appendix, that would frighten the living daylights out of me if I had an appendix that had to come out. Okay? Because that's just too tedious and too all-consuming of a criteria. On the other hand, we need to know that doctors can successfully and safely remove appendices, and so that's a different kind of criteria. Now, this is an important piece too, and again, this is an issue that would take quite a few weeks to consider if we had the time, and that would be to match your evaluative design to your company's culture. Only you and your colleagues can do that. I can't do that for you sitting at my desk now and telling you what to think. Again, the more nearly you recognize values and beliefs and the assumptions that drive the actions and the priorities of your company or your group, whoever and whatever it is, the more nearly able you are to do that, the more you'll be assured that you'll come up with strategies that don't violate the culture. Certain cultures aren't going to want to play Goldilocks and the Three Bears because they're not built that way. They don't have the capacity sometimes to role play, as an example, or they don't have that kind of interaction skills, or they may get so involved with it they'll wind up playing Candyland with you for 2 weeks and 2 days or 3 days, and you will have missed the mark on that count. The more nearly you can be assured, and again, I would use a think tank group to be the most nearly assured that the company's culture is open to this, has the capacity to get to those strategies, the better. On the other hand, there's another way to look at this. If you want to do something that's going to shake people up, because you believe that the culture, or maybe your boss believes, or you agree that the culture is moribund, which is the fancy word for sitting back on its heels, or that the culture is toxic, and you want to create processes where people will be less toxic or be more collaborative, or be more effective at this task that they have to do, and you want to shake them up, then you have to be at least take the responsibility for recognizing that this may not be in alignment with the company's culture, but in fact it's meant to shake the culture of that company out of its stupor. And again, there was a cost benefit analysis. You can bring in guys like me or people or lots of really important and famous people. I'm not putting myself in that category, certainly, who will come in and for $10,000 tell you a great story and have everybody crying and hugging each other and whatnot, and you wouldn't have learned a thing. Or you may want to put everybody on a plane and take them to Nepal to do mountain climbing, one of those team building kinds of things. And your boss may not want to spend that kind of money because it may not have the benefit, it may not be a payoff. And certainly, the decision makers above you and with you will have opinions about that. Important point: big data, workforce analytics, value. There's lots of analytics to be used nowadays that were not at our disposal, and you can call it a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's more good than bad, although there's certainly some negatives here and there. The more data you have, and the more data that and more of the capacity that you have to draw from that data what it tell you, By the way, data is a plural word, and I just grammatically said it correctly, though it doesn't sound correct. Data is a plural word, but so you have to treat it like a plural, which is why I say data are when I use that in my conversations with people. And I mean, I often think there is data, which can overwhelm people and divert people from what you need to know. Mark Twain once said, I'm trying to remember the quote. Mark Twain once said, I can't remember, I'm sorry. There is statistics and damn statistics. I'm leaving something out. And because you can pretty much find statistics to prove anything you want if you watch the cable news programs, unfortunately. As far as housekeeping is concerned, we'll skip that. I already talked about that. We've already talked about the rationale for evaluating your effort. You need to know why you need to do what you need to do. And we talked about Peter Drucker, who talks about the fact that training does make a difference, but you need to know how you will know whether or in fact your objectives have been met and that they're linked to the long-term intents of the culture. Now, here's that word I talked about before, formatively evaluate. Somebody, sorry, I can't remember your name, but you talked about being fearful that when you're working with a group, that the group may not be successful in learning what you wanted them to learn, and then you don't know how to adjust for that. And that's a very legitimate concern, very extremely legitimate concern. Professors in colleges like me don't even worry about it, not this one though. But professors in colleges don't worry about those things, unfortunately. They just forge forward with their silly lectures. And if you get it, you get it. If you don't get it, you don't get it. And that's wrong, because a formative assessment is exactly what it sounds like. You can see the football receiver here. He is adjusting to the flight of the football, because his original path was not in line with where the football was going to land. So if he continued on the same route, he would miss the ball. And so he adjusts. And so along the way of his process, he formatively adjusts. Or the quarterback perhaps did that. He saw this receiver break free in a different place, and he changed how he approaches things. An example of this I use often, and it makes sense, is you're talking about missions to Mars within the next 10 years, I think. So if I were to, let's say 10 years from now, if they were going to put me in a spaceship and send me to Mars, I'd be pretty concerned about that. I knew that they knew where they were sending me. Because the truth of the matter is, as the missile launches from the rocket pad, and it goes up into the atmosphere and then ultimately out into space. If it's aimed at the Mars that's presently in that position, this moment, it's going to miss Mars, because Mars is a moving football. And so what computers will do, and the engineers in mission control will do, is they will monitor the trajectory of the space capsule, rocket ship, whatever you want to call it, to be in line with the path that Mars is taking. And if anything goes goes wrong, they'll just fire a little rocket jet, and adjust it. That's formative assessment. And so when you were in high school and you didn't understand quadratic equations, and who remembers how to do quadratic equations, unless you need to know that? But the good math teacher took your temperature, saw that you got all 3 questions wrong on the exam, and said, come here, let's talk about this. I have to teach you how to do quadratic equations again. If you weren't getting the lug nut on the wheel turned tightly enough, someone should be able to say, come over here, Bernardo, and let me show you how to do this, and this is what you need to do rather than what you're doing. That's formatively assessing. That's not waiting until all the lug nuts fall off the car as it gets on the highway. That's dangerous. what you do is you assess along the way, not just at the end. So there's two kinds of assessments. It's formative, that's along the way, and then there's summative. Two different functions. Formative is along the way, for intervention, for support, for adjusting. And there's summative for it, to whether we hit Mars or not. And if we didn't hit Mars, then what happened? But if you crash on Mars because you didn't, or you miss Mars altogether and land in Jupiter, you can sum that up by saying we didn't do that right. But it's too late to change it because you didn't do the formative assessment along the way. Imperative that you build in as many. Now, what does a formative assessment look like? Many ways to do that. Somebody in discussion mentioned questioning. A great way to do it if the questions are aligned with the goal. And if they're aligned with the Bloom's taxonomy we've spoken about as well. You don't ask a high-blown HOTS question if you don't need to ask that question. You might just ask, you might just need to say, is this a wrench or is this a pair of pliers? And you take it from there. We've already talked about pilots. Oh, another thing to do too is, I should have mentioned this before, is you might want to pilot something. If you have the time, absolutely recommend this. Pilot sort of reminds me of Peter Senge and the 5 disciplines we've spoken about a little bit, where he said you don't try to do something straight away. What you try to do is you pilot it to see whether it works. And if it doesn't work, then you haven't destroyed the company. An example is it's changed, but an example is industrially was the Japanese automakers overtook the American automakers probably, I guess, around 30 years ago. And one thing they were doing, one thing the Americans were not doing is they weren't piloting. They were churning out the cars. After all, we had the best automobile workers and the best automobile plants in the world. And who's going to question the quality of what we do until things started to go wrong? Sometimes very unsafe things started to happen. People died from some of the poorly designed cars that we were making here. Whereas in Japan, no car hits the road. No newly designed car hits the road the moment it comes off the assembly line. What it does is it's instead expected to be pilot tested. And so what you do is people drive those cars for a couple of years to see whether the wheels fall off or whether the paint stays on, or whether the brakes start to go, the things that we would want to have checked before we spend all that kind of money on a car. That's called piloting. So if you can pilot some of the things you do, you're well served. And that's in the ideal situation, but I absolutely urge you to take a look at that. Because that's about ROI, the return on investment, where you can then therefore pinpoint your strengths and your weaknesses in order to justify your planning and execution, and analyze whether or in fact the population with which you're working has mastered what you want to have happen. And that all swings back or embeds itself in the idea of long-term value for the company's culture and intent, its purpose. And it also gives you a hint, especially a pilot. Say, well, maybe I got to think about another way to do this. Again, as I've said last week, I believe too, what I'm doing now, I'm doing this on purpose, is what I call talking heads. Not a great way to learn. The only way I can justify it to myself is I think that the visuals I'm giving you and some of the things I need to get you to look at, as well as the text, will support the learning that I'm talking to you about. And you need to know what you're measuring as such. Reaction is whether the learners, do you care, or does it matter to you, or is it the goal that the learners will feel satisfied? Maybe not, but more likely yes, but maybe not. Is it important to you that they master, not 3 out of 5 times, but 5 out of 5 times they can find where the appendix is? That they need to also be able to master, be experts at the skills and the processes they need to know. They may be able to point at where the appendix may be, but they may not know exactly how to get at that old store appendix, and you may not feel that comfortable with trusting somebody who hasn't been trained properly to do that. And what's the payoff? What's the return on investment? So these are all yardsticks you need to use, okay, to evaluate. There's that word again. Evaluate your evaluations as such. Lots of ways to do this. I always caution against surveys, believe it or not. Surveys are often very poorly written and are not valid. I can show you example after example of this. And so to do that is problematic. It asks for problems. Because the perceptions and the disposition, it may ask for perceptions and dispositions. If you care what people think and how they feel, they're pretty good. But if what their attitudes are about things, but they're not necessarily good examples of what a culture is, for example. They're better examples of climate, which is a difference between climate and culture. Culture is what we do and why we do it. Climate is what we think that we do and what we think we're doing. Two different things. And so a survey should always be piloted to make sure that you know you're asking the right question. This is a terrible example. Let me try to rephrase it so it doesn't sound quite as terrible. Terrible example, but I can't think of a better one. Answer yes and no. Have you stopped beating your dog? A terrible example. I think of the answer. Yes, I've stopped, which means you did do it, or no, I haven't stopped. People ask stupid questions on surveys and get away with it. And you have to be extremely careful about what you're trying to do. You need to know what it is you're actually trying to measure per item. So a test for content and skills, you have to know what you mean by test. Otherwise, I would avoid a survey, or at least be careful insofar as how I interpret the data. You can do what we call an observation process. And that's called a participant observer approach, where you can have a consultant or have somebody from within your organization just take notes, see what they see when the people are engaged in the learning processes. Were people looking out the window? Were they writing each other emails? Were they playing solitaire on their computers? Were they trying to turn those lug notes properly? Were they practicing client satisfaction strategies with each other? Or were they talking about what they're going to do tonight? So participant observer is a lot of expectation on a participant observer. Sometimes I would recommend multiple ones, but it's got probably more value than what a survey might ask you to do. Again, behavior rating processes is essentially you're going to watch how the processes are done and then rate the things that you see working well and things that you may want to address more carefully. It's a little different from the participant observer explanation I gave you a moment ago. You're going to have blind rating systems. That's why it's nice to have more than one person, I should say, and not have them rate together, but rather have them rate separately, so that you can then compare the ratings and see whether they saw the same things or whether they did not. And if they did not, what's that about? Contiguous scoring is basically on the whole of the W is when raters, outside raters, have different scoring systems from each other. Let's say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I rate everything a 5 and you rate everything a 2. That's a problem. It means they're not contiguous. If it was a 4, 5, or even a 1, 2, or a 2, 3, that would be okay. But if they're spread apart, there's something wrong with the raters and what they think that they see. Pluses and minuses, we talked about this already. If we were looking at cultural relevance, you can see that on the one hand, you're measuring outcomes. On the other hand, which could be contaminated by what's going on. On the other hand, you're looking at deficiencies in terms of objectives, because objectives are always deficient rating. 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5, 3 out of 5 means if you hit 2 out of 5, that's a deficit. Doesn't really take the positive side that well. What's relevant is when the objectives are related to the training objectives, as we spoke about before. If they're aligned and they're related and the people can agree to that, then you're in the right place. And so you need to consider certain premises. Relevance, reliability is a little bit different. In other words, the yardstick that you use is always reliable. If I measure the pen with my ruler and it's, I guess, 4 inches long, with a conventional yardstick or ruler, and then I take another ruler and it's 3 inches wrong, there's something wrong with the ruler. And so the premise is that everything has to be reliable. You have to get repetitive results on that. Does it discriminate somehow? Does it somehow favor people? This is a very important point. The strategies you use enable you to reward a group versus another, not on purpose necessarily, but because of the way it's set up. So if I would, again, I know I've used this example many times. If I again were to be evaluated on whether I could get the lug nuts on a wheel, and you were measuring me against the number one engineers or lug nut assemblers in the Western world, and then they turn around and say, "Well, see how bad he is." That's discrimination in a certain sense. You have to take a look at that. We talked about evaluating, matching your company's culture to its to the design you put together. We've used that before. Remember, the culture has beliefs and assumptions above all and above everything, or below all and way down deep and beneath. It has values and priorities. It has artifacts that it creates, the products that it comes up with that are metaphors for your beliefs and assumptions. And so those symbols, those analogies, those themes, those patterns and discrepancies, that's what you need to look for. What you see running through all of the conversations or all of the activities, what you see in patterns, and more importantly, what you see that's not in pattern, that's not analogous, that seems to be outliers, and try to come up with understandings of why this evaluation approach may be wanting. Again, what are you trying to consider here? Do you want to effect change? Do you want to examine potential? In this day and age, I would think opportunity to meet many needs and populations is an issue. Is it cost effective? Do you have, or do the people whom you hire to do this have the expertise to analyze these data? If they don't, then find someone else or change the data set. Above all, do you have the time? And are you really trying to enact sustainable change, which would require that you have the capacity that you consider the group has that to begin with. All issues to consider when you're trying to create I can't say that word today, evaluative strategies. So then you come up with a post-test. Well, first of all, you have some kind of pre-evaluation. Again, the pilot point might be the best way to look at that. And then some sort of post-pros. Yeah, we taught people how to, we taught doctors not only how to locate a bad appendix, but it's successfully extracted and the patient left. That's a post-test. Let's have the statistics on that. To our 6.7 in the no book, and in the text speaks to this very nicely. And really, we're talking about quantitative. Why can't I talk today? Quantitative statistics. Again, big data, workforce, and value. Now, chapter 7, we'll talk more specifically about the coming attractions of what are really the more promising processes that you can create or co-create that you may not have considered before, because you just thought what you should do was a talking heads kind of thing. And in fact, there are other ways to skin the cat as such. Take care.